I got a question. It's regarding with the hard problem of consciousness. I do understand in a way, and I don't understand in a way. I know that it's a subjective experience. Could you shed a little bit light on it?
On the hard problem of consciousness?
Yes.
You mean like you just want like an outline of the idea of it, or what you think my
What?
resolution to it
Yeah.
is, or what?
Yeah. The problem with the hard problem of consciousness, as I get it, is that we have a subjective experience of the world that is outside. We don't go and the experience doesn't come to us. You know what are the objects, the experience of the objects is subjective and it happens inside our brain. The objects
Yes.
don't come into us through the
Yeah.
perception of our senses. That experience comes into us and we become the witness of all that we experience through the senses.
Yeah,
Do
some
you know
people call
anything
this
about?
qualia, but
Yeah,
some
yeah,
philosophers don't think
yeah.
that that's a thing. I'm actually kind of reading a book on the philosophy of science right now, and the author talked about this early on. I don't really remember very much of what he said, or I was too dumb to understand it, probably. But like the idea is, when I see an apple in my brain, or see it in my brain, when I see an apple, what is that? Well, we know the apple is not sending tiny apple particles toward me, and an actual apple is what I'm seeing and experiencing. It's a hallucination or whatever. But we have no idea what that is. Like I can close my eyes and see my mother. Or with my eyes open, I'm seeing myself right now. But that's not me. I can point to it. I can see in space that it's over there. But this is all being mentally represented in my head or whatever, and in my consciousness. And we just don't know what that is or how to describe it. That's at least what I understand as the hard problem of consciousness. It's just impossible to say what it is. Now, what I will say is sometimes stuff like this gets brought up with me. I don't particularly think that like what do you call it, dualism, like Descartes' idea. I don't think that gets us anywhere, because he said the mind is a non-physical thing. Well, if it's non-physical, then it can't interact with your body. That just I can't remember what her name is, but he wrote out his theory and he sent it to this other philosopher, and she was I can't remember what her name was, but she wrote back to him and said, yeah, this is actually a terrible idea. It doesn't make any sense, because you're you're just saying the mind must be something that we can't even understand, and that actually doesn't make any sense with respect to a corporeal being having a non-physical element of it. That makes no sense. And he just promptly ignored her, and nobody remembers her, including me, and I've looked into the story, so that's pretty tragic. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, are we? Do we really exist here, or are we witnessing this body and mind? Do we really exist here?
Well, I think that the mind comes from the body. I don't think it's non-physical. I don't think it's the other way around. I don't think our mind controls our body, or that the mind is this thing that makes the body animated or anything like that. Because that doesn't make any sense to me. It really never has. But other than that, I can't really tell you much. I think I can back up my belief by saying things like, well, we know that you can physically alter a conscious experience. It's not even hard to do. Lick a toad or drink some booze. That's really all it takes, right? Or see the person you love after not having seen them for a really long time. That's all it takes. And if we obviously can't boil down the totality of a conscious experience to something physical. Like, we can't yet create, at least as far as we know, artificial life that thinks and that has a consciousness. But I don't think we would ever know if we did either, because there'd be no way. These are what are called pea zombies. There'd be no way of telling if a like. Have you ever heard of a pea zombie before?
Yeah, yeah, yep.
Yeah, it's like the idea is like it could be an actual person that isn't even alive, but is just somehow moving about as if they're a biological robot, and they don't actually have any thoughts, but they can respond to you and talk to you exactly like a living conscious person could. There's fundamentally just no way of knowing it, right? So I don't think we could ever know if we created an artificial life or whatever that is conscious. But I don't think we have to have the totality of it in order to say with some confidence that it is merely physical, because we start with a baseline consciousness and we know we can manipulate it physically. Well, if we can manipulate it physically, then why on earth would I've never heard a good explanation for why the thing itself would be non-physical and not come from the brain in the first place. So,
Okay. I got one last question before I go.
go ahead.
With this entirety of this universe, including all the cosmos, space, planets, everything, does it give us indication of anything? It's an intelligent design, or is it just a spew of something that's just going around here and there? Is it intelligent design by design? It's come up by some intelligence, or is
Sure.
it just a spew of stuff up there?
Um, I I think the idea of intelligent design is just something that it's us reading ourselves into the cosmos. I think this idea comes from Richard Dawkins, actually. It's a concept he calls the tyranny of the discontinuous mind, which is basically we anthropomorphize. I actually don't know how to say that word correctly, I don't think. But we do that with everything. So we look at the universe and we claim that there's all this order and fine structure and everything in it. And yes, perhaps the universe is finely tuned that intelligent life exists in it, but I don't really see how that is an argument that it was therefore created by something. That just ends up being a property of the universe, and then intelligent life is an inevitable outcome of it. But also, if you look at the universe is, for the most part, all the ideas about God and stuff like that came about from people that thought that Earth was basically most of the entire universe. And then they expanded that a little bit and like, well, I mean, like the universe is like kind of big, but if you sat at the edge of the universe and had a good telescope, you could theoretically like look at Earth and kind of see some interesting things going on, probably. Maybe not people walking down the sidewalk, but like a volcanic eruption, And but then so that makes Earth incredibly special, and so that drives us to say, gee, why the heck did everything work out so awesome for us? But then, like, the universe as we currently know it is so empty that take literally anything in the universe, or literally a billion, you can take a billion things in our universe and just pretend they don't exist, and the universe doesn't care. The universe is fundamentally no different if you delete our galaxy from it, for example. It's the vast majority of it is empty, hostile, non-conducive to life, and whatever else. We happen to occupy a privileged position, but that's like, to me, that's like saying, yes, if you flip a coin 100 times, the sequence that you get would be, you would need trillions upon trillions of millennia to get that exact sequence of flips again. But it doesn't mean that the flip you got was miraculous in any way.
Yeah. Can I ask one more question before I go? I know. Have you got some time?
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Regarding the distance that we can see, look into the galaxy, how far can we look into this universe with our perception or through telescopes? What is the farthest limit we can reach? And What are the implications of knowing this?
So, funny enough, when you say how far can we see, if I were on top of a mountain and you asked me that, I would tell you how far away is whatever object. But with the universe, the more interesting question is actually how far back in time can you see, right? As far as I'm aware, the current technologies like with Hubble, I don't think we can see beyond the first billion years. I said Hubble, I meant James Webb. How far can James Webb? I want to Google this because I don't want to get this wrong, but I've seen diagrams of it. Oh my god, now I have to.
Are we
What do you
looking?
call this? They call it the James Webb. They call it like a horizon.
Are we looking at distance or are we looking at time? What is it?
Well, both,
Both.
because the distance isn't actually all that interesting, but we can see like what's really funny is the universe is about 13.7 billion years old, but the edge of the observable universe is like 43 billion light years away, so we can see about that far. But the question of time is kind of the more interesting one. So this says that James Webb can see. Oh yeah, I was so far off. So if the universe is 13.7 billion years old, the James Webb can theoretically see, it looks like about 13.4 billion
Nearly the
years
same.
back in time,
Okay.
which I don't what that would correspond to in distance. I really have no idea. And that's like I said, that's actually not the more interesting question. The more interesting question is how far back in time can it see? So, yeah, it looks like roughly about 13.3 billion years.
Right. Okay. So that's the edge we can go. Definitely, there's things existing beyond that as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean the universe was doing things. We have some models that say, from what I'm looking at, it says that James Webb can approximately see the the portion in time when we think the first stars were forming. Gravity had not yet allowed those stars to necessarily collect into like large galactical structures.
But so what is entropy?
There's more than one way to tell what it is. Like for me, like the intuitive explanations make the most sense because physics is the area of science that I am like weakest in or whatever. But entropy is just like the observed fact that things always tend toward disorder and or things always tend to cool down. So like for example, if you set out a cup of coffee, it can't spontaneously get hotter. That just doesn't happen. Although like with radioactive decay, there are some things that where that kind of does happen, but like a system will lose usable energy over time, and that comes in different forms. So things never like broken glass doesn't reassemble itself, and well, cups of coffee don't heat up; they only cool down. Now, it's theoretically possible that they could, but or like another example is if you pour creamer into coffee, it always, you never get just creamer on top, coffee on bottom, or you'll never get just creamer on bottom, coffee on top. They always just mix perfectly and blend to this like homeostatic state or whatever. Now, it actually is possible that all of the creamer somehow just goes to the left side of your cup and all the coffee goes to the right side of your cup. It's possible. But there are so many different ways that the particular particles can be arranged so that it appears like, evenly mixed. There are so many more of those that statistically it's just simply impossible that you end up with coffee on the left side and creamer only on the right side. I mean, like picture you had a dice with a billion, trillion, trillion faces on it. And on one of those faces is the number 10, and then all the others are blank. What are the odds that you're going to roll a 10? I mean, it's absurdly low. It doesn't, like, it almost doesn't matter how long you roll the dice. The universe will stop existing. The universe will, like, destroy itself or whatever before you ever land that thing on a 10, right? That's kind of like an intuitive way, for me at least, of thinking about entropy.
How would you disprove if you would, if, even though I know you believe in the Big Bang Theory, how would you disprove it?
So to disprove I mean, there were other attempts, and I don't really understand the intricacies of them, but, you know, this guy, Fred Hoyle, he's the one that came up with the word for the Big Bang. He believed in a
Mhm.
steady state, but a steady state maintained that, like, a universe can sort of like expand, but as it does, it creates new matter in the process, so that the density of matter in our universe always remains constant. And that's just not true. I mean, we just know that. I don't really know how you could prove that. I mean, I would guess the farther out into space we look, and therefore the farther back in time we look, we should only see galaxies that are just like the ones of today, maybe, I guess. And so, like, perhaps that could be how you disprove it. There's this plasma theory that I don't really know anything about, but that was proposed as like an alternative to the Big Bang. Like, I'm not going to try to explain it because I really don't get it. I've heard it described before, but I forgot all of it. But if you could demonstrate that, I think what the plasma theory was designed to do is to tell us that, well, no, the redshift isn't actually redshift. It's like, for some reason, plasma somehow gives us the illusion of redshift.
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't remember exactly. But if you could prove that the redshifts we see are an artifact of something else, or they're an illusion, that would be catastrophic for the Big Bang. That would be fatal right then and
Okay.
there. That's kind of like somehow demonstrating that the universe isn't expanding is kind of really the only hope you have, I think. So that's what I would say, I guess.
But so I thought, and like I said, I'm not real big into. I love science, but I'm not real big into it. So I'm not real knowledgeable on it. So to make that clear ahead of time. So a lot of this stuff gonna sound real remedial to you because you probably know a whole lot about this. But something I never understood, and maybe you can explain it to me, why do galaxies spin in opposite directions?
Well, the main reason is that in space there's no such thing as a direction. You know, there's no such thing as up, down, left, right, forward, backward. Not really. Everything in the universe, it has its own momentum. Everything's flying around, and like, our universe expands, but gravity's going to cause objects to come together at this angle or at that angle or at this angle, and that'll just always be different no matter where you are. Like, for example, we can see other solar systems, but we can only see them in our galaxy. And some of them, when we look at them, the solar system, it's like we're looking at it from the top down or the bottom up. It looks like this.
Mm-hmm.
But others are head on, you know, like that. And
Mm-hmm.
others are slightly slanted. Because when materials come together, the reason everything in space spins is because gravity causes objects to go together,
Mm-hmm.
but never perfectly. So they're always going to be off by a tiny bit, and then that causes them to deflect. But then they're going to be reattracted, and so then you
Change the momentum. Okay.
yeah, basically well, it changes the direction, kind of,
Yeah.
in a way. And because gravity acts in all directions and things are moving kind of in all directions, it's going they're going to be the orientations are going to be random. We'll just say it like that.
So here's the next question. Now, I maybe I asked you this about 6 months ago when the last time I talked to you, but I can't remember. So I'm gonna ask you now. What is the Earth? Excuse me. What is the universe expanding into?
Oh yeah,
If
somebody
it
asked me that earlier. So I'll try to make it brief. Somebody asked this earlier. That question, for all we know, just doesn't actually make any sense, because if the universe is expanding into something, then that means that there's something else other than the universe. But that
Mm-hmm.
term is just synonymous with all of existence, right? So the only thing we can say scientifically is that this universe exists. We can't say scientifically anything about, is there something, does the universe even have an edge, whatever that means, and is there something beyond it, or is it just this universe, or is our universe infinite? Those aren't questions we can really address. And so to speculate about what if there is something outside of it and does the universe expand into it, science just couldn't ever work with that. We could never get a working theory for that, because that's information that's just like fundamentally unknowable, or so that's how it seems.
All right. So let me ask you this: what about the universe that you find hard to believe, or has you? So, I yeah. So I
That
leave it
that
at
it
that.
that it begins at a point, because what was going on before that? That makes zero sense. And that the universe will one day, well, but how the universe could potentially end. That also
Mm.
just makes no sense. Like the universe might just literally expand forever, and then all of the physical matter will just decay into radiation, but then all that radiation will basically redshift until the universe exists, but there's literally nothing in it. That
Okay.
just makes no sense. That's
All
hard to
right.
wrap my head around.
Let me ask you this. So let's say since we don't know what we're expanding into, wouldn't that in some ways presuppose that time? So if time, space, and matter had to come into existence at the same exact time, but we're expanding into something,
Yeah,
wouldn't that
so
lead someone to believe that time and space and matter was already here?
well, no, because here's how like maybe that is the case, but you can just offer a counterexample that isn't impossible. So, for example, well, not like for example, but space time, the universe currently has space time, but can a universe that doesn't have space time exist? I don't see why not, because when we run the clock backwards, the entire universe begins to collapse. Eventually, it collapses to a point where it's some sort of singularity. Maybe it's something very slightly different than that. But all that the universe contains can be transformed into like different forms. Maybe the universe, we get to the point where there's no matter, but it's all energy. What is the size of energy? Well, that question doesn't even make any sense. We can cram everything about the universe into an infinitesimally small space, perhaps,
Mm.
right? Now, maybe something happened. People talk about quantum fluctuations or whatever, but then that universe that exists, it sits there, but there is no space time. It changes, it evolves to begin expanding, and then space time begins to be a thing that
But
the
but
universe possesses.
so
It's just an evolution of the universe. Now, if that
here's
doesn't make any sense, I agree, but we know that black holes exist in our universe. So we can take matter and cram it into something that, for all we for all the laws of physics can understand, there's no space-time inside of a black hole. Okay, well, that can happen in a universe, I guess. Can the entire universe be crushed into a state like that? Perhaps it can. I don't know. I
but let me
just,
ask you
when
this.
people make the leap that therefore it was created because we have a beginning point in time, no, time could be circular, or I think physicists call these past eternal models. A universe exists forever. It's just that time doesn't actually exist.
So let me say this. Let me ask you this, because here's where you lost me on. So let's say everything was brought down into a singularity. All right,
Sure.
where obviously inside of a black hole, according to what you were just saying, nothing. It doesn't take up in space or anything, but that edge does. So correct me if I'm wrong. The edge of a black hole is different from the inner. All right, so that's a space.
Yeah, but there's no time once you cross
Why?
that barrier.
But once you cross the barrier, but prior to crossing the barrier, there's space, there's time.
Yeah, so outside the barrier is like when the universe began expanding.
No,
Inside
no,
the
no,
barrier is like prior to that.
no, no. What I'm asking is, let's say the only thing that exists right now, for instance, just in this hypothetical, the only thing that is existing is a black hole, for instance. That's the only thing in the universe is a black hole.
Okay.
It is that right there, space, time, and matter.
Well, if you're inside of the event horizon, from what I understand, like there's literally zero time. So
Let's say
I would
right on
say
the edge.
no, it's not. It's not space time.
But let's say we're right on the edge. We're right on the edge. We're not in, so we're not over the event horizon. We're right on the edge, on the outside edge. You know what I'm saying? So let's say
Yeah, but now
see what I'm
now
saying?
you're asking me you said the black hole is the universe, but now you're saying you're just outside the edge. That means you're not in the universe. So
Oh, I see what you're saying.
this isn't a question that I could give you any kind of scientific answer for.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. All right. What I was saying, but I was saying it based on the fact that, well, I said it. I guess I might have said it wrong, because when we're saying that the universe is expanding, it's expanding into what? So I'm using that as the same scenario. I'm putting the black hole in the universe that we're expanding into. You see what I'm saying? So at some point we started out small, and it's expanded, and it's been expanding ever since. So my question would be, if you put that black hole in the same type of universe that expands on its own, or however you want to call it, or however it does it, would you have space, time, and matter at the very edge of that black hole? You understand what I'm trying to say, or no?
Not exactly. I mean, I have no idea. I just again I don't think this works because you're saying, well, we know that there is space time outside that event horizon. What about at the edge? I just don't think it's analogous to like trying to think about what the universe is doing, because the black hole, we know there's a universe outside that, but when it comes to the universe expanding, we don't know anything about if there was anything beyond it.
All right, all right. Now, next question. I guess this is gonna get a little bit more into the creation of life. So I asked this: with all the different, when we look at life and the creation of the universe, and the odds of the sun being where it is, the odds of the moon being where it is, the odds of humans create human life developing, and then evolving into different things, trees, grass, etc., etc. How, so to you, how hard, if you put your science hat to the side for a second, how hard would you believe for that to be possible without uh, someone guiding it or design? I just want to know what you would think if you put your scientific hat to the side.
Yep.
How hard would that be for you to believe that something, that everything that I have it seems to me the
The
odds of happening
the
are
prob
so great, astronomical, that it's
the problem is you have it completely backwards.
okay.
Um, Life evolves and adapts to the conditions that it's given, not the other way around. Like the universe doesn't have conditions that work perfectly for life. Life finds a way, and life is actually pretty bad. Most things don't live very long at all,
Mm,
and they self replicate. But eventually, life on this earth will stop, and the universe will exist for uncountable quadrillions of times longer than life ever existed on Earth. So, in the grand scheme of things, the system of chemical reactions that we call life were they didn't amount to anything, right?
mm,
So, like for example, life exists across an enormous range of temperatures and pHs and pressures and concentrations of nutrients and concentrations of sunlight, sometimes in the complete absence of sunlight. across our planet. If our planet was suited just right for life, then to me that would mean that life would have to be very narrowly confined to certain spaces and environments that are just right for life. But instead, they're wildly different. There's we can almost certainly take life on our planet, simple life, and put it on Jupiter's moon Europa, and it would flourish. But Europa is 5 times farther away from the sun than we are. There's no land. Uh, so, the conditions there are just so bewilderingly different, right? So there's no requirement for like a creator at all, because life is chaotic and fussy and fickle and dies very easily, but it does find a way to cling to existence on the planet in a way that it can replicate successfully. But it does that across such a huge range that I see nothing special about Earth actually.
So then let me ask you this question. Because I guess these are a lot of questions that go through my mind, because when I think about symbiotic relationships with animals, with bacteria and things that's over there, how did, like, there are certain animals that cannot live without certain bacteria and
Well,
vice
us, for
versa.
example. Yeah.
All right. So how did this happen? So in other words, how were, I don't know how to explain it. How are they able to survive if without this bacterium, unless, I'm trying, because it
Yeah,
would seem
no,
more
no.
about,
Your question's a good one, and it's kind of an irreducible complexity argument. So if two things have a symbiotic relationship, they can't live without each other, then they could have never spontaneously evolved to coexist, because one can't exist without the other, and they can't just miraculously come together at the same time. Well, the problem with that is it just completely ignores the idea that things change over time, that they evolve. At this point, yes, maybe those two things are inseparable, but that doesn't mean that they had the same degree of inseparability across all of time. Like, gradually they become more and more dependent. Like a simple example I could give you is, like, we have to have gut bacteria, right?
mm-hmm.
But you're not born with it. So a human doesn't need gut bacteria to live, like, in the first place. That stuff gets introduced to you from your environment. They get it through breastfeeding. I think part of the birthing process, going through the birth canal, introduces it a little bit too. I don't know a ton about that. That's so, like, that's how we know that organisms get introduced to these things that they are, like, dependent upon in their environment, right? Another, like, the one with symbiotic relationships is kind of hard to like try to tell a story about, but what I try to talk about is camouflage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, there are leaf mimicking insects, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, like, the camouflage they have is just, like, it's breathtaking. If you've never seen one before, you're missing out. They're fantastic. And what evolution deniers say is, look, that can't evolve, because you can't go from some random type of bug to a bug that looks like that. That can't evolve, because all of the complexities and the crazy anatomy it has to have, that has to all be present, or natural selection doesn't favor it over anything else. And you're asking too much of that. It's like saying that one day an animal gives birth to an animal with wings, and that's where birds come from all of a sudden. Terrible logic, because what that logic proposes is that you have fully developed leaf mimicking insects competing against members of their own species that aren't, like, fully developed in that way. And natural selection won't favor them, but that's not how it happened. Instead, we begin in a world where there are no leaf mimicking insects at all. Now, what if one day, let's say that these insects are green, because that's just kind of a common color in the first place. So they blend in a tiny bit in the first place. Whatever.
Mm.
What was I going to say? And then a generation of them are born, and some of them are just like a little bit flatter than the others. Well, that's a little bit more leaf shaped, right? The thing with this is the survival advantage only has to be that big. It only has to be microscopic for it to have a noticeable effect. And so over time, we call this directional selection, the bell curve of individuals just starts to shift toward some sort of phenotype or whatever. And then generation after generation, they become just incrementally a tiny, tiny bit flatter over time. And then maybe one day one is born and it has like weird patterns on it that are vaguely leaf mimicking. Maybe just a central one that kind of looks like a leaf vein or something, like whatever. Anyways, the thing to keep in mind is that they're always competing against members that are not the fully developed one. And people just pretend that what's going on is you have fully developed ones and not fully developed ones. And they can't ever progress to that fully developed state. It's like you have this so backwards. And with the symbiotic thing, again, that's harder to illustrate, to verbally illustrate or whatever. But just imagine two organisms that aren't inseparable but depend on each other. But then over time, maybe something in their environment changes. Maybe they were codependent with like a third species, but it goes extinct. And then that forces them to be more codependent, and then so on and so forth.
So how would you describe life? Or how would you describe how life began here on Earth? How would you describe it?
I can only give you an extremely low resolution answer, which is through chemistry. And people that I watched a couple of abiogenesis debates on Modern Day Debate with this fucking moron named Taylor, this chick, and God, she's so dumb. But what I wish people would have said is, okay, here's a series of questions for you, just yes or no. Every time a cell divides, does a miracle happen? No. Every time a cell copies DNA, does a miracle happen? No. Every single time that the mitochondria phosphorylizes ADP or whatever, does a miracle happen? No. Literally every single question you could ask about the metabolism of cells and how cells are able to exist, is that a miracle? The answer would be no. And then you'd have the devil's own job of having to try to give me a reason why, if no miracle is required for life to exist, why would a miracle be required for life to originate in the first place? Why would the origin of something be somehow fundamentally completely different from its operation? Because, look, a very long time ago, the same people that still don't believe in this said that there was a force that produced life. And we found out that that's completely untrue. They thought that life was composed of particular elements that are completely different from nature. And that turned out to be completely untrue. They said that, okay, well, still, the molecules that living things have, only life can produce those molecules. That turned out not to be true. If any of these people could live for 500 years, which, man, I'm glad that they don't, but I'm glad that nobody does, actually. But if anybody could live long enough to see how much ground they've had to concede, they would give up on this. But instead, they're ignorant and blind about the history, and they don't understand that they're standing at the edge of a cliff when they once occupied an entire plateau.
All right. So I guess what one of the things I want to ask you is, when I'm looking at life, let's say, so for first and foremost, because I'm sure you got this question before, if life produced itself back in the day through chemistry, why did it not continue? Why is it not continuing today? I guess that'll be a question. Maybe a dumb one.
Why hasn't life spontaneously?
Yeah. What made it? So one, where do scientists happen to know where this happened at? on Earth, and also whether or not scientists figured out why it stopped happening.
Sure. Well, life originating probably is like wildly improbable, but also if it ever tried, like wherever environment life first appeared on, those environments, something like them probably still exists. A lot of people think it was near hydrothermal events, but um, it, if even if that could happen today, all of the molecules and resources that it would try to how do I say this, that would try to get the process going again would just immediately become consumed by life itself, you know, by living
Hmm.
things that are there. And any products they would make, it would just be overcome with the by, you know, the living cells that already exist. Basically, it would be outcompeted immediately because life already exists. What's
So
up?
I haven't been following you for very long. I just wanted to ask before I ask my like proper question. What are your like full credentials? Are you a biologist, a geologist, or
Well, I have a bachelor's degree in biology. It's like a double major, biology and education.
okay? So you'd
My degrees
probably
in
be a
biology. I did a little bit of, you know, I did a couple animal studies when I was in college. I have my lab notebook over there. The effects of petroleum derivatives on Xenopus laevis tadpoles. But I'm not a researcher. I haven't published any scientific work. I, I'm mostly self-educated on with respect to, like, you know, the sciences that I teach and that I enjoy.
fair enough.
I'm self-taught in pretty much everything except like the basic biology that I picked up in college, I guess.
Okay, fair enough. Um, so you'd probably be a good person to ask questions about evolution then. Yeah,
Yeah.
sweet. Okay, so I don't fully, I don't have like a full understanding of evolution quite yet, but what I want to ask is essentially the way that I hear it is that random mutations happen on the gene level. Those random mutations are then selected for by natural selection to continue and grow a trait within a population.
Yeah.
Is it
There's also this concept called Evo Devo. They call it developmental evolution, which says that, well, perhaps, and I think it's both. I hate how people say, like, no, it's this thing, no, it's that thing. Why can't it be
okay?
both? But what developmental evolution says is, so you can have genes. We have thousands of genes, and
Yep.
pretty much all of our genes have more than one function, and pretty much all of your traits are the result of multiple genes working together in some way. There's some things where there's like one gene correspondent to it, but most other things, it's a enormous symphony. So we know that those traits can be greatly altered by the timing of when certain genes are activated and inactivated,
Hmm.
and stuff like that. Development, sorry, development. What Evo Devo proposes is that the changes that occur are perhaps even more influential than actual structural changes to the genome, right? So, like, for example,
Okay.
there have been simple experiments that have been done where we can induce chickens. They have in some parts of their body they have scales, in other parts they have feathers. You can
Yeah.
do really simple manipulations to the tissue that is supposed to grow a scale, and it'll instead grow a feather. Now, I don't know if they do that by changing the actual sequences of their DNA, or if they just do it by chemically altering like the timing of those genes. I don't know which one that is,
Mm.
but that's just an extra proposed mechanism for what causes the changes like the phenotypic changes in organisms. So
Okay,
that's just like an added piece.
fair. Well, my question is essentially this, and I'll try to phrase it as best as I can, but I'm not too well versed in all this, so do tell me if I need to clarify. But is it possible that the uh, that the mutations that happen on the gene or on the DNA level are reactive to the environment that the creature, its generations are placed within, rather than being random? They're
Yes, but
like,
not in the way you're saying. So this is called epigenetics. We've known about this for a while. So the how this really got thrust into science was through two very horrific natural experiments, which was the 1944 hunger. It was a famine in Holland created by Nazi occupation. They blockaded the entire country, and huge numbers of people starved to death. They weren't getting any food. And then during China's Great Leap Forward, where Mao had all these revolutionary agricultural ideas that ended up being administratively and practically absolutely catastrophic, and something like, I don't know, 15 million or more people starved to death because of that. Anyways, what we found out was mothers who were pregnant during the famine, their children were like many times more likely to develop obesity. Now, what happened was your DNA is extremely long and very complicated, and parts of your genome are zipped together, and other parts of it are opened up. Now, there's a process called methylation, which I always forget if methylation binds DNA or opens DNA. I always forget. And then there's an opposite process. There's a process that does the exact opposite of methylation, and off the top of my head, I'm forgetting what that is too. But basically, there are just like receptor sites on your DNA where certain molecules can be accepted to open the DNA or close the DNA in certain locations. What that does is it alters the symphony of gene expression. It alters the timing and basically kind of like the interactions that those genes have, because the vast, like I opened up with, the vast majority of our sort of like characteristics, traits or whatever, and especially like things like metabolism, it's multifaceted. So for whatever reason, stress induced those mothers. I think actually it wasn't mothers that were pregnant at the time. It was mothers that became pregnant very shortly after like during the famine, I think, because what it did was it caused structural changes in their egg cells in the DNA, and basically pre-programmed, because your DNA has the potential to do enormous things, and in a very weird way, it's sort of like pre-programmed the genome to be more receptive to like retaining calories. Basically, it pre-wired the metabolism in this way, and so then their children basically inherited that. So that is epigenetics. It means above the genome. So literally changes to the DNA that weren't genetic changes.
like structural changes, like they
to
changed
the
the order.
genome, but not changes of the genes, which is like what a mutation would be, right? And that can be inherited. Now, you can't really pass that down, though, is the thing, because those children, they didn't grow up in a famine, so their bodies were much more efficient at retaining calories, and they're, like I said, more likely to develop obesity, but their children weren't, because it's environmentally induced.
Okay, but like if they were inside of if that famine had like continued into those children's lives, then it would have likely been passed down.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So, yeah, my question is like, is it possible that is, or a similar process is happening on the genetic level or on the DNA level, and that's what causes these big changes that we see over generations?
I kind of doubt that it would cause big changes, because
over generations. I mean, like,
Right. I I don't know. That seems tricky to me because these epi, at least this particular example, that's a stress induced thing. Now,
yeah,
I mean, it is interesting. This would be extremely difficult to figure out. Uh, but after we see rapid evolution happening after extinctions. Now,
yeah,
why is that? Well, because a whole bunch of niches that certain organisms were occupying, well, now that most of them are dead, those niches open up. But why is it that the niches get filled? Well, I think there's a pretty good case to make that natural variation, which comes about mostly through mutations. I think natural variation gets us to the point where we can fill in those niches. Like you can create different phenotypes in a population to the point where they start occupying different niches, to the point where they no longer interact with other members of their population, to the point where they get driven apart because they're not reproducing with each other. Now they become completely different species, and then they continue evolving in even more dramatic ways. I think that like the traditional view gets us to that. Now the stress thing, it is a really interesting question because obviously if a mass extinction event has occurred, although organisms are surviving, I wouldn't say they're thriving, right? So
well,
to
yeah,
what degree do epigenetic effects and changes in gene expression cause that widespread variation? Like I said, that would be extremely difficult to try to prove. What we could do perhaps is get a bunch of mice or something that breeds really quickly, throw them on
well,
a I don't know on an island and
I have an idea.
mimic a catastrophic extinction or something on it. Like I don't know, that would be the way to do
Well,
it, I guess. But
I have an
that would be so hard to
idea that
parse out.
I have an idea that could possibly uh, prove it, assuming that I understand this all correctly. Uh, there was an old, well, I don't know how old it is exactly, but there was a test that was done in a lab where they got bacteria that had like a single tail that helped it move around to find food. And through very specific changes in its environment, they bred it through hundreds or thousands of generations. And then when they looked at the bacteria again, it had three tails to make it move faster.
Oh,
Um,
weird.
um, or like not literal tails, but like little rotor
Yeah, like
things.
flagella. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and then when they put it back in the original environment, they found out that although it moved faster, it couldn't like the um, stick to the petri dish as well, and so it couldn't like stop itself, and so it died out more than the original
Yeah,
bacteria.
it's an
Um,
unfortunate trade-off.
exactly. But my thought process is if we were to look at the very first original generation of that bacteria, would we find some members of that population that would have the mutation that would eventually turn into the three tails? Or is that something that only starts, if that mutation is something that only starts to appear once we start changing the environment?
So with
That's my thoughts.
that particular example, I mean, I don't know, but Richard Lenski has been doing a bacterial experiment literally since the 80s. Like it's the longest running evolution experiment on the planet. And they've seen some really fascinating mutations. Like in
Is that
one of their groups, the bacteria spontaneously evolved the ability to digest citrate, which is really cool. What they freeze like at the end of every week or something like that. They take just a small sample of the bacteria out of the flasks, and then that propagates into the next generation. But they freeze them, right? So they
yeah?
have gone backwards and retroactively looked at when these things happen. They can go backwards and like say, okay, where did this come from? And I know they have seen like they identified like where it first originated, and they can tell like no, this gene doesn't have the capacity for what it can do now. It had to mutate to do that. So like that is knowable, extremely difficult to try to know. However, but yeah,
Fair.
I think that the mutations probably get us the majority of like structural changes. That's my
Well, I'm not.
guess.
Yeah. I also think that like mutations would probably get us the most variety. I'm just wondering if those mutations are like truly quote unquote random, or if they are in
Oh
response
yeah, the
to
mutations
whatever
are
environment.
definitely random.
Well, okay, like what's the experiment that like proves that 100%? It's
Well, I mean, any population, the variation is like fundamentally unpredictable. I mean, even like I mean, even the DNA that you get from your parents, I mean, that part of it's fundamentally random too, because you'll get a random collection of, you know, you get half your mom's DNA, but which half of your mom's DNA you get, uh, you don't know. That's so. Um, that's not exactly a mutation, but you know, a spontaneous change to the genome. I mean, there's no guiding process behind that. So in terms of
well,
like, how do we know it's random? What experiment could you do? There are that's a good question. There are forced inbreeding experiments. I had to read about these for this book I wrote, where you basically take like you can take like yeast because they don't feel pain and they reproduce really quickly, so the ethical considerations aren't really there for this. And when you do the forced inbreeding, you find that what you're doing is you're removing natural selection, and you find a wider distribution of fitness. And to me, that's exactly what randomness looks like non-random. The mutations are random, but the selection isn't. But when you remove natural selection, what you find is a greater variety of fitnesses within the yeast, which, because what's happening is you're letting all of the genetic recombinations, you're letting all they all have like almost equal, not exactly, but you're leveling the odds for reproduction more with that, but that causes the population to become more different. So to me, I think really only the changes actually being random could define that. Because if they were non-random, then natural selection would be a non-factor, basically.
I don't think it would be a non-factor. I think it would just be like a speed up process, make it go faster in the wild.
Well, you
But
can't
like the
speed up
evolutionary,
mutations or anything like that.
no, but you can speed up how much those mutations proliferate within a population.
Well, actually, I would sort of say no, because what natural selection actually does is it kind of it almost simplifies the genome in a way, because when you do these experiments, you get bar graphs, and let me just try to draw it real quick here. A hallmark of evolution is if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So we call this like stabilizing selection. So the population or their fitness starts off like this because there's a particularly good way for those bacteria to or their yeast, I guess, or whatever, to survive in their environment. But natural selection favors those, so you get like, because the fitness is really tight. To me, at least intuitively, what that's telling me is the genetic variation is not huge in there. But when you do the forced inbreeding, then that makes the fitness bell curve much wider. To me, that's telling me that we have more mutations in there, which means we have more genetic variation, right? So in a way, it actually kind of, now the way it's true is natural selection can cause what we call directional selection, which is where it favors changes in the organisms, like it drives them toward being more like this particular way, and so that causes a certain cluster of mutations to proliferate. So that changes it, but it doesn't overall increase like the number of mutations. I wouldn't say.
Okay. I guess. Hmm. I guess an experiment that I'd like to see done, which probably will never get done because of logistical problems, but one that I'd like to see what the result of would be if we got a population of yeast or bacteria or mice or something, and we made sure that every single individual in that population reproduced and produced offspring, and did that for as many generations as possible, would we see like natural selection would normally select for specific traits, right? That make the creature more adaptable to its environment. But if we, by making sure that the ones that aren't adapted to the environment don't reproduce, but if all of them reproduce, would we still see these traits grow more and more common, or would they not? That's my thing. That's one that I'd like to see.
Well, actually, that's what that experiment's designed to do. And yeast don't really have traits. I mean, they're unicellular organisms, right?
Yeah.
But what that experiment does is, I think it actually does show that, because you get more, you get greater variety because you're not letting natural selection filter out unfavorable characteristics. Now, when we talk about inbreeding, most of us kind of think about, like, the way we do like dog breeding and stuff like that. But that's not that's very different because we're still selecting. It's artificial selection, and we are severely limiting reproduction. Actually, it's very inbred, but these forced inbreeding experiments, you're not limiting the reproduction. You're just everybody gets a turn. We'll say it that way.
Yeah. Fair, fair. I'm probably gonna have to have a look at that yeast experiment because that sounds really interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
Um,